Sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought with swords, but with the courage to care when the world tells you not to. Sometimes the strongest warriors are those who choose to heal instead of harm. In the frozen village of Skarnheim, Jorund Grimsson was a giant of a man who had lost everything that mattered. The people feared him. The elders avoided him. He had become a stranger in his own home, but on one bitter winter night he found a dying woman in the snow. Her name was Liv, and she had been cast out by her own people. While the village turned their backs, Jorund carried her to safety. As she healed by his fire, something unexpected happened. Their broken hearts began to mend together, and their love would change not just their lives, but an entire village's understanding of what it means to be strong. But what secret was Liv hiding that could either save them all or destroy everything? Before we begin this tale, tell us where you're listening from, and if this story moves you, subscribe because tomorrow brings something truly special. The dying lantern flickered against the howling wind, its amber light dancing across the snow like a weary heartbeat. Jorund Grimsson had been walking the village perimeter for hours, as he did every night when sleep refused to come. The massive war axe that once sang in his hands now hung silent above his cold hearth, gathering dust like the songs once sung of his valor. 3 winters had passed since the Battle of Raven's Gorge, where his 2 younger brothers fell defending these very lands. 3 winters since the village children stopped running to greet him, since the women ceased their grateful smiles, since even the elders who once sought his counsel now crossed themselves when he passed. The victory had been complete. The enemy routed, but the cost, the terrible, irreversible cost, had transformed their hero into something they could no longer comprehend. Jorund paused beside the dying lantern, its feeble glow barely reaching his weathered face. At 35, he stood nearly 7 feet tall, his shoulders broad enough to block doorways, his hands scarred from countless battles, fought for people who now whispered that war had taken not just his brothers, but his soul as well. Perhaps they were right. He had felt something die within him that day on the blood-soaked rocks, watching young Gunnar breathe his last, while brave Olaf's eyes stared sightlessly at the grey sky. The wind carried voices from the village centre, where the great longhouse glowed with warmth and fellowship he was no longer welcome to share. Elder Magnus would be holding court, his white beard wagging as he spoke of tradition and proper ways, his pale eyes sharp with the kind of wisdom that came from never having blood on his hands. The old man had made it clear that Jorund's presence disturbed the peace, that his very sighs and silence reminded people of violence they preferred to forget. Let him brood alone, Magnus had declared after Jorund's last attempt to join the evening meal. A warrior who cannot find peace after victory is no warrior at all, but a beast that has forgotten how to be tamed. The words still stung, not because they were cruel, but because Jorund feared they might be true. He had tried to return to the man he was before, the young warrior who laughed with children, who carved toys for the little ones, who could gentle a frightened horse with a whisper. But that man seemed as distant as his brothers' voices, lost somewhere in the screams and clash of metal that haunted his dreams. Young Astrid the healer had tried to help, brewing teas that promised peaceful sleep and offering herbs that might calm a troubled mind. She was perhaps 25, with kind brown eyes and gentle hands that worked miracles on wounded flesh. Her father had been the village's previous healer, and she had inherited both his knowledge and his compassion. But even Astrid's gifts could not heal wounds that went deeper than flesh and bone. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget, she had told him one autumn evening, her voice soft with sympathy. Sometimes healing takes longer than we wish, Jorund. Sometimes it takes a lifetime. He had thanked her and left her herbs untouched. What use were remedies for pain when the pain was all that remained of the man he used to be? The village itself reflected the harsh realities of survival in these northern lands. Skarnheim sat in a valley, protected on 3 sides by rocky hills, its wooden buildings clustered around the great longhouse like children seeking shelter from their mothers' skirts. Smoke rose from chimneys into the star-scattered darkness, carrying the scents of roasted meat and baking bread that spoke of warmth and belonging. But this winter had been harder than most. The harvest had been thin, the stored grain running low, and already the weaker members of the community showed the hollow-cheeked look of those who gave their portions to hungrier mouths. Elder Magnus preached that hardship-built character, that their ancestors had endured worse with dignity and strength. Yet Jorund could see the fear in people's eyes, the way mothers clutched their children closer when the wind howled through the gaps in their walls. Young Eric, barely 16 but tall for his age, still spoke to Jorund with something approaching hero worship. The boy's father had died in the same battle that claimed the Grimsson brothers, but Eric seemed to find comfort in Jorund's presence rather than fear. He would sometimes appear at Jorund's door with questions about sword work or tales of the old warriors, his eager face bright with the kind of hope that made Jorund's chest ache with memory. "Tell me about the battle with the Sea Raiders," Eric would say, settling cross-legged before Jorund's fire. "Tell me how you and your brothers fought back-to-back against 50 men," but Jorund could never tell those stories anymore. The words would stick in his throat like stones, heavy with the weight of all that had been lost. Instead, he would speak of other things, of the importance of protecting rather than conquering, of the strength that came from knowing when not to fight. Eric would listen politely, but Jorund could see the disappointment in the young man's eyes, the hunger for tales of glory that would never come. The village women had their own ways of dealing with hardship. They gathered in small groups to share work and worry, their voices rising and falling like gentle waves as they mended clothes, prepared food, and tended to the endless needs of family life. But their conversations grew quiet when Jorund passed, their eyes lowering, as if his very presence might somehow contaminate their peaceful world with memories of violence. Only old Sigrid, the blacksmith's widow, still greeted him with anything approaching warmth. She had lost 3 sons to various wars and seemed to recognize in Jorund a kindred spirit touched by loss. Her withered hands would pat his arm when their paths crossed, and her rheumy eyes would hold understanding rather than fear. "Grief has its own seasons," she had told him once. "Summer will come again, boy. It always does." But as Jorund stood in the bitter wind, watching the dying lantern struggle against the darkness, summer seemed as distant as his brother's laughter. The village slept around him, trusting in walls and tradition to keep them safe. While he walked the borders like a guardian, they no longer wanted but still needed. It was then, as the lantern's flame guttered and nearly died, that he saw her. She lay crumpled in the snow, perhaps 50 paces from the village's edge, her dark cloak nearly invisible against the winter ground. Only the pale gleam of her hair caught the lantern's fading light, spread across the white like spilled silver. For a moment Jorund thought she might be dead, another victim of the harsh winter that had already claimed 2 travelers and an old beggar who had sought shelter too late. But as he knelt beside her, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as they turned her face toward the light, he saw the faint mist of breath rising from her blue lips. She was young, perhaps 30, with features that spoke of northern blood, but carried the refinement of someone born to better circumstances than dying alone in the snow. Her clothes, though travel-stained and worn, had once been fine, the cloak lined with fur, the boots made of quality leather, the dress beneath woven from good wool. Most telling were the runes carved into small stones and sewn into her cloak's hem. Jorund recognized them with a chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind. They were exile marks, brands of shame that marked their bearer as cast out, forbidden to seek shelter or aid from any who honored the old laws. To help someone bearing such marks was to risk sharing their punishment. Yet as Jorund looked down at her still face, at the way her frozen fingers clutched a leather satchel as if it contained her very life, he felt something stir within him that had been silent for 3 long winters. It was not the battle fury that had once driven him to legendary deeds, nor the protective instinct that had made him his brother's shield. It was something quieter, deeper, a recognition of shared suffering, of loneliness that ran as deep as his own, The village behind him slept on, warm and safe in their certainty that some people deserved help and others did not. They would wake to find her frozen corpse and shake their heads at the wisdom of natural law, at the justice of exile marks fulfilled. They would bury her in unmarked ground and speak of the importance of maintaining proper boundaries. But Jorund Grimsson, the giant warrior whom they feared and shunned, made a different choice. He gathered the dying woman into his arms, feeling how little she weighed despite her height, how her body trembled with the last whispers of life. He turned his back on the sleeping village and carried her toward his own small dwelling, where a fire still burned and where no one would ask questions he was not ready to answer. As he shouldered open his door, the woman's eyes fluttered open for just a moment, pale blue like winter sky, filled with pain but also with something else, gratitude perhaps, or recognition, as if she had been waiting for someone to see past the marks of exile to the person beneath. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Then consciousness left her again, and Jorund was alone with his choice and all its consequences. Outside, the dying lantern finally surrendered to the wind, and darkness claimed the village's edge. But inside Jorund's small home, firelight danced across two faces, one weathered by war and loss, the other pale with cold and exile, as the first threads of change began to weave themselves into the fabric of their lives. Dawn came slowly to Skarnheim, pale light creeping across snow-covered rooftops like a reluctant witness. Jorund had not slept. He had spent the night tending the fire, watching over the woman who lay unconscious on his sleeping furs, her breathing shallow but steady. By morning light, he could see her more clearly, the fine bones of her face, the calloused hands that spoke of work despite her quality clothes, and most prominently, the exile runes sewn into her cloak with careful, deliberate stitches. When she finally stirred, her pale blue eyes opened slowly, taking in the rough wooden walls, the simple furnishings, the massive man sitting quietly beside the fire. She tried to speak, but only a whisper emerged. "Water," she managed. Jorund brought her a cup, supporting her head with surprising gentleness as she drank. The simple act of kindness seemed to overwhelm her, and tears tracked down her cheeks. "I am Liv," she said when she could speak again. "Liv Eriksdottir of—" She stopped, her hand moving instinctively to the runes on her cloak. "Of nowhere now, and you are the giant who saved me from the snow, Jorund Grimsson," he replied simply. "This is my home. You are safe here." "Safe?" A bitter laugh escaped her. "Do you know what these marks mean?" She touched the carved stones sewn into her cloak. "I am exiled, cast out, marked as one who brings shame to any who shelter me. You'd risk much by helping me?" "I have little left to risk," Jorund said quietly. Over the next hour, as Liv's strength slowly returned, fragments of her story emerged. She had been traveling for weeks, seeking some place, any place, that might offer shelter to one bearing exile marks. Her own clan, the Ironwood people who lived 3 days' hard ride to the east, had cast her out for crimes she spoke of only in whispers, her voice heavy with pain that seemed to go deeper than physical suffering. "I thought I might find sanctuary in the northern settlements," she said, accepting the simple porridge Jorund offered. "But winter caught me, and my horse—" Her voice broke. My poor horse couldn't go any further. But their quiet conversation was interrupted by the sound of voices outside, growing louder as they approached. Jorund recognized Elder Magnus's commanding tone, along with the deeper voices of Bjorn the blacksmith and Harold the huntsman. Heavy footsteps crunched through the snow toward his door. "Jorund Grimsson!" Magnus's voice rang out with authority. "Open your door. We would speak with you." Jorund looked at Liv, saw the fear that flashed across her face. She started to rise, perhaps to flee, but he gestured for her to remain still. "Stay," he said quietly. "Whatever comes, you are under my protection." When Jorund opened the door, he found not just Elder Magnus, but half the village council standing in his yard, their faces grim with purpose. Young Eric hovered at the edge of the group, his expression worried. Behind them more villagers gathered, women with children clinging to their skirts, men with the hard faces of those prepared for difficult decisions. "We know what you have done," Magnus said without preamble. "Old Sigrid saw you carrying someone into your home last night, someone who should not be here." "I helped a dying woman," Jorund replied evenly. "Nothing more." "Show us," Harold demanded. The huntsman was a lean, weathered man with eyes like a hawk's. "If she is what we suspect, the marks will tell the truth." Jorund stepped aside, knowing he had no choice. The council members filed into his small home, their eyes immediately finding Liv, where she sat wrapped in furs beside the fire. She had pulled her cloak around her, but the exile runes were clearly visible. The silence that followed was heavy with judgment and fear. "By the old gods," Bjorn whispered, his scarred hands clenching into fists. "She bears the full marks. Exile, shame, blood debt, all of them. You know the law, Jorund," Magnus said, his voice carrying the weight of ancient tradition. "No one may shelter the marked ones. Their crimes stain all who help them." "What crimes?" Jorund asked, looking directly at Liv. "What did you do that earned such punishment?" Liv raised her chin, meeting the hostile stares with dignity despite her fear. "I killed my clan leader's son," she said simply. "I drove a knife into his heart and watched him die." The collective intake of breath was audible. Even Jorund felt shock ripple through him, though he kept his expression neutral. "Murder," Harold spat. "And we wondered why the exile marks were so complete." "It was not murder," Liv said, her voice growing stronger. "It was justice. But justice delivered by a woman's hand is seen as a different crime entirely. The why matters not," Magnus declared. "The marks are clear, the law is absolute. She must leave Skarnheim before sunset, or we all risk the wrath of the gods and the condemnation of every honorable clan within 100 leagues." "And if she cannot travel?" Jorund asked quietly. "If the cold has damaged her too badly for her to survive another night in the wild?" "That is not our burden to bear," Magnus replied coldly. "She made her choices when she committed her crime. The consequences are hers alone to face." It was then that young Eric pushed forward from the crowd. His face was pale but determined. What if there were reasons? What if the killing was justified? "Silence, boy," Harold snapped. "You know nothing of such matters." But Astrid the healer had been quietly examining Liv with professional eyes. Now she spoke up, her voice calm but firm. "This woman is ill. More than just cold, there is fever, and her hands show signs of severe frostbite. To force her to travel now would be a death sentence." "Then it is a sentence the gods have already pronounced," Magnus said. "We will not compound her crimes by defying the ancient laws." The debate that followed was heated, with voices rising as fear and principle clashed. Some, led by Magnus, demanded immediate expulsion, regardless of Liv's condition. Others, particularly some of the younger villagers, questioned whether mercy might sometimes outweigh law. Through it all, Jorund remained silent, his eyes moving between Liv's pale but resolute face and the arguing council members. Finally, Magnus called for order. "Enough! The law is clear, and I will not see our village cursed for the sake of a confessed killer." He turned to Jorund, his pale eyes hard as winter ice. "You have until sunset to see her gone, Jorund Grimsson. If you refuse, you will share her exile. Choose now, your village or this stranger." The ultimatum hung in the air like a blade. Jorund looked around the room at faces he had known all his life, people he had fought for, bled for, lost his brothers defending. He saw fear in their eyes, but also trust that he would do the right thing, that he would not force them to choose between their safety and their consciences. But as he looked at Liv, sitting straight, despite her weakness, facing condemnation with a dignity that reminded him of his fallen brother's courage, he realized his choice had already been made the moment he lifted her from the snow. "Then I choose her," he said quietly. The words fell into silence like stones into deep water. Magnus's face went white with shock, then red with anger. "You would abandon your home, your people, for a confessed murderer?" "I would not abandon a dying woman to satisfy laws written by men who never had to watch someone freeze to death in the snow," Jorund replied. "If that makes me an exile, so be it." As the council members filed out in angry silence, only young Eric and Astrid remained behind. The healer approached Liv with her herb pouch open. "If you're staying," she said simply, "then I need to treat that fever properly." Eric nodded firmly. "And I'll help watch the borders. If trouble comes, we should know about it early." Magnus's voice carried from outside, addressing the gathered villagers. "Let no one say we did not show mercy. They have until sunset to leave Skarnheim forever. After that, any who help them share their fate." As the crowd dispersed, Jorund knelt beside Liv, seeing in her eyes a mixture of gratitude and guilt. "You should not have done this," she whispered. "I am not worth such sacrifice." "That," Jorund said quietly, "is not for you to decide." But even as he spoke the words, he wondered what secret lay behind her exile marks. What truth might justify such a desperate act? And somewhere in the distance, beyond the village borders, riders had been spotted on the horizon, dark figures against the snow who seemed to be searching for something, or someone. The hours after the council's ultimatum passed, like stones dropping into still water, each one creating ripples that spread through the village in whispered conversations and worried glances. Jorund's small home had become an island of defiance in a sea of uncertainty, and as the day wore on, he began to understand the true weight of his choice. Astrid had returned twice to check on Liv's condition, bringing with her a leather pouch filled with healing herbs that she pressed into Jorund's hands with quiet determination. The fever had broken by midday, but Liv remained weak, her body fighting off the damage from her ordeal in the snow. As she regained strength, she also regained her ability to feel the full burden of what Jorund had sacrificed for her. "You had a life here," she said, as evening shadows began to lengthen. "Friends, family, a place where your name was known." "My name was known," Jorund admitted, stirring the fire with a long iron poker, "but not always kindly. Perhaps it is time for a new beginning." Liv watched him with those pale blue eyes that seemed to see more than most. "Tell me about your brothers." The request caught him off guard. He had spoken of Gunnar and Olaf to no one since their death, had barely been able to think their names without pain. But something in Liv's voice, her understanding born of her own losses, made the words come easier than they had in 3 long winters. "Gunnar was the youngest," he said finally. 22 summers, with a laugh that could fill a longhouse and a singing voice that made women weep. He carved the most beautiful things, little birds and flowers that looked ready to take flight or bloom. Always said he would make his fortune as an artisan when the fighting days were done. He paused, lost in memory. Olaf was closer to my age, steady as stone, practical. He knew the name of every star, could track a deer through any terrain, could make a fire in a downpour. When he spoke, people listened because his words were always worth hearing. They died protecting this place. "They died because I led them into battle," Jorund said quietly. "Because I believed that strength alone could solve any problem, that victory was worth any price. I was wrong." Before Liv could respond, a soft knock came at the door. Jorund opened it to find young Eric standing in the twilight, his arms laden with supplies, bread, dried meat, warm clothes, and a heavy winter cloak. "From those who believe you're doing the right thing," Eric said quietly, glancing around to make sure he wasn't observed. "It's not everyone, but it's not no one either." As Eric set down his burden, he looked directly at Liv for the first time. Where others had shown fear or disgust, his young face held only curiosity and a hint of admiration. "You really killed a clan leader's son?" he asked. "Eric," Jorund warned. "It's all right," Liv said. She studied the young man's earnest face, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "Yes, I killed him. But before you decide whether that makes me a hero or a monster, you should know the whole truth." She reached for her leather satchel, the one she had clutched even while unconscious. From it, she drew a small collection of items. Dried herbs, strange roots, bottles of tinctures, and tools that looked like a healer's instruments. "I was my clan's healer," she said simply. "These are my tools, my knowledge gathered over 15 years of learning. I could treat wounds, cure fevers, ease childbirth, even perform surgery when necessary. My father taught me as his mother taught him. Eric leaned forward, fascinated. So why? Because Knut Bjornsson, the clan leader's son, decided that my knowledge belonged to him, Liv continued, her voice steady, but her hands trembling slightly as she handled her instruments. He wanted me to help him in ways that had nothing to do with healing. He wanted me to brew poisons for his enemies, to use my skills to torture information from prisoners, to create substances that would make his father's rivals compliant. The word hung in the air with ugly implications. Jorund felt a cold fury building in his chest, while Eric's young face flushed with understanding and anger. When I refused, Liv went on, he said he would have his way regardless, that my consent was not required for anything, not my knowledge, not my person, not my life. He tried to force himself on me, and when I fought back, she held up a small, sharp blade that had been hidden among her healing tools. I used this. It was meant for surgery, for saving lives. Instead, I used it to take one. That's not murder, Eric said fiercely. That's justice. Try explaining that to a clan council made up entirely of men who saw profit in Knut's plans, Liv replied bitterly. They called it the murder of an innocent man by an ungrateful woman. They said I had seduced him with promises of forbidden knowledge, then killed him to hide my own crimes. Jorund understood now why her exile marks were so complete, why she had been cast out so thoroughly. It was not just about the killing, it was about a woman who had dared to defend herself against a man of power, who had chosen death over submission. The worst part, Liv continued, carefully repacking her instruments, is that there were people I could have helped. Children with fevers, women dying in childbirth, men with wounds that festered. But my exile means I cannot practice my healing anywhere that honors the old laws. My knowledge is trapped, useless, while people suffer. Not here, Astrid's voice came from the doorway. They turned to see the young healer standing in the entrance, her brown eyes bright with determination. Not if I have anything to say about it. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. I heard what you said, Liv, Eric's daughter, about your training, your knowledge. My father taught me well, but there is always more to learn, especially about difficult cases. She paused, choosing her words carefully. If you were to share your knowledge with me, teach me what you know, would that not be a way to use your gifts, despite the exile marks? Liv stared at her in astonishment. You would risk association with me. Your reputation, your standing in the village? My standing means nothing if I could have saved lives but chose comfort instead, Astrid replied firmly. Besides, someone needs to treat the injuries when those riders Eric spotted decide to make their move. Riders. Jorund's attention sharpened. Eric nodded grimly. I've been watching like I promised. There are at least a dozen of them, maybe more, camped about 2 leagues east. They're not moving toward the village, but they're not leaving either. Just waiting. For what? Astrid asked. Liv's face had gone pale. For me, she said quietly. They're from my clan. Knut's brothers, probably, or his father's men. They want to finish what the exiles started. The little group fell silent, the weight of approaching danger settling over them like a winter cloak. Outside, the village went about its evening routines, unaware that the choice to shelter an exile might soon bring war to their doorstep. But in Jorund's small home, around the fire that had become a beacon of defiance, 4 people sat planning not just survival, but the first steps towards something none of them had expected to find. Hope. The next morning brought with it a strange sense of purpose that Jorund had not felt in 3 winters. As dawn light filtered through his small windows, he found Liv and Astrid already awake, huddled together over the healing implements spread across his rough wooden table. The old community loom that had sat unused in his corner for years, a relic from when his mother was still alive, had been pulled closer to the fire. It needs repair, Liv was saying, running her hands along the wooden frame with practiced fingers. But the structure is sound. With some work, it could weave again. My grandmother always said that weaving kept communities together, Astrid replied, examining the tangled threads. Each strand depends on all the others. Jorund watched them work, struck by how naturally they had fallen into collaboration. Liv's knowledge of plants and healing, combined with Astrid's understanding of local conditions. And village needs was already creating something new, a shared wisdom that neither could have achieved alone. The fever that's been affecting the children in the western houses, Astrid was explaining. We've been treating it with willow bark and rest. But it keeps returning. Recurring fever often means the infection has settled deeper, Liv said, pulling a small, gnarled root from her satchel. This is mountain sage root. It grows wild in rocky soil, but you have to know when to harvest it. Combined with honey and red clover, if you have any, it can break a fever's hold entirely. We have both, Astrid said excitedly. Old Sigrid keeps bees, and red clover grows wild near the stream. But I've never seen anyone use mountain sage that way. As they spoke, their hands worked together to clear the loom's mechanism, removing old threads and straightening the wooden components. It was slow, careful work that reminded Jorund of building something meant to last, not the quick, violent construction of battlefield fortifications, but the patient creation of something that would serve for generations. Eric arrived mid-morning with disturbing news about the riders. They've moved closer, he reported, his young face grave with responsibility. Still not approaching directly, but they're definitely watching the village. I counted 15 of them, all well armed. Any banners? Identifying marks? Jorund asked. Iron wolf heads on their shields, Eric replied. And their leader, he's asking questions in the settlements to the south. About a woman traveling alone, marked with exile runes. Liv's hands stilled on the loom threads. That would be Hakon, Canute's eldest brother. He's not content to let exile be my punishment. He wants my death to balance his brothers. Then perhaps it's time the village understood what they're really defending. Astrid said quietly, before anyone could ask what she meant. The sound of voices outside announced visitors. But these were not the angry council members of the previous day. Instead, when Jorund opened his door, he found Gudrun, the baker's wife, standing in his yard, her arms filled with fresh bread, her weathered face set with determination. Behind her stood several other women, Solveig, who tended the goats, Freydis, whose husband had died in the same battle as Jorund's brothers, and even young Ragnhild, barely 20 and heavy with her first child. We've come to meet the healer, Gudrun announced without preamble. Not to judge or condemn, but to learn. The women filed into Jorund's small home, their eyes taking in the scene around the loom, the healing implements, the careful work being done. Solveig spoke first, her voice hesitant but determined. My youngest has the coughing sickness. Astrid's remedies help, but each winter it comes back worse. If there are other ways to treat it, show me, Liv said simply, setting aside the loom work. What followed was unlike anything Jorund had ever witnessed. As Liv examined the various ailments the women described, chronic coughs, difficult pregnancies, infections that wouldn't heal, she didn't just offer remedies. She explained her reasoning, taught them to recognize symptoms, showed them how to prepare treatments themselves. Healing isn't magic, she said as she demonstrated how to properly prepare a poultice. It's knowledge passed from one person to another, tested by experience, improved by understanding. A healer who keeps her knowledge secret serves no one. Young Ragnhild, whose pregnancy had been difficult, listened with particular attention as Liv explained techniques for easing labor pain and preventing complications. In my clan, Ragnhild said quietly, women died giving birth because the healer said pain was natural, that suffering proved worthiness. You're saying there are ways to help? There are always ways to help, Liv replied firmly. The question is whether we choose to use them. As the morning progressed, the loom slowly took shape under many hands. The women worked together, sharing the labor and the conversation. Their initial wariness of Liv gradually replaced by respect and something approaching affection. They spoke of their families, their fears for the coming winter, their hopes for their children's futures. This is what I remember, old Gudrun said, as she helped thread the loom's mechanism. From when I was young, before the wars changed everything. Women working together, sharing knowledge, supporting each other through hard times. The men have their councils and laws, Freydis added, but we have each other. We always have. It was then that Magnus arrived, his face dark with disapproval as he took in the scene. The women continued their work, but the atmosphere grew tense. "So it spreads," the elder said coldly. "First one bleeding heart, now half the village women. Do you understand what you risk? If those riders come seeking their exile, will your new friendship protect you from their blades?" "Perhaps," said a new voice from the doorway. "We should be asking what would happen if we abandoned our friends to satisfy strangers' thirst for blood." Everyone turned to see Bjorn the blacksmith filling the doorway, his massive frame and soot-stained hands making him an imposing figure. Behind him stood several other men, farmers, craftsmen, even young warriors who had trained under Jorund before the battle changed everything. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, Magnus," Bjorn continued, his deep voice carrying quiet authority, "about laws and traditions. But I've also been watching those riders, and I've been remembering other laws, like the one that says we protect guests under our roof, and we don't surrender our own people to foreign enemies." "She is not our people," Magnus protested. "She is marked, exiled, condemned by proper law. She is under Jorund's protection," Bjorn interrupted. "And Jorund is one of us, whether you approve of his choices or not. That makes her one of us too." The confrontation that followed was quiet but intense, with the village effectively split between those who feared the consequences of defying tradition and those who believed some principles were worth defending regardless of cost. Through it all, the women continued their work on the loom, their steady rhythm a counterpoint to the heated words. As Magnus finally left in frustrated anger, Liv looked around at the faces surrounding her, some friendly, some uncertain, but all engaged in the same work of creating something new from the threads of the old. "Thank you," she said simply, "all of you." But even as the words of gratitude were spoken, the sound of horses in the distance reminded everyone that their choices had consequences, and those consequences were riding closer with each passing hour. The morning mist clung to the valley like the breath of sleeping gods as Jorund made his way to the place he had avoided for 3 winters. The memory stone stood on a small hill overlooking the village, its granite surface carved with the names of those who had fallen defending Skarnheim. Jorund Grimsson and Olaf Grimsson were etched there in runic script, their names forever linked with honor and sacrifice. He knelt before the stone, his massive hands tracing the carved letters with surprising gentleness. The words came slowly, rusty from disuse. "I have made a choice, brothers," he said quietly to the silent stone, "one that would have seemed impossible when we fought together. I have chosen to protect rather than avenge, to heal rather than harm." He paused, listening to the wind through the bare branches. I hope you would understand." The crunch of footsteps in the frost-covered grass announced another presence. Jorund turned to see Liv approaching, moving carefully but steadily. Her recovery had been remarkable, aided by her own knowledge and Astrid's careful attention, but she still tired easily. "I thought I might find you here," she said, settling beside him on the cold ground. Her eyes took in the memorial stone, reading the names and understanding their significance. "Tell me about them," so he did. For the first time since their deaths, Jorund spoke of his brothers not as fallen heroes, but as the men they had been. Gunnar's terrible jokes and skill with wood-carving, Olaf's quiet wisdom and his way with animals. He spoke of summer afternoons when they were children, of shared dreams and brotherly competitions, of the easy love that had bound them together. "They died because I believed strength was the answer to everything," he said finally, "because I led them into a battle that could have been avoided with wisdom instead of warfare. Or they died protecting something they loved," Liv replied gently. "Sometimes the same event can hold many truths at once." She was quiet for a moment, then reached into her cloak and withdrew something wrapped in soft leather. "I want to show you something," she said, unfolding the wrapping to reveal a small wooden figure, a bird in flight, carved with exquisite detail. "Gunnar made this?" Jorund asked, recognizing the style, though he had never seen this particular piece. "No," Liv said softly. "I did. My father taught me carving along with healing. He said working with wood taught patience and precision that served both crafts well. She held up the tiny bird, its wings spread as if caught in eternal flight. I carved this the night before I killed Canute. I was thinking about freedom, about what it would be like to simply fly away from all the anger and violence. Jorund studied the carving, seeing in its delicate features the same skill that had marked his brother's work. You have his gift. Perhaps gifts run in patterns, appearing where they're needed most, Liv mused. Your brother carved beauty to balance the harshness of the world. I did the same before—" She stopped, her voice catching. "Before you were forced to choose between submission and survival," Jorund finished. "That was not your failure, Liv. That was theirs." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the village wake below them. Smoke rose from chimneys. People emerged to tend animals and begin their daily work. Children played in the snow despite the cold. It looked peaceful, normal, but Jorund could see the subtle signs of preparation: men checking weapons, women gathering in larger groups, supplies being quietly moved to more defensible locations. "The riders came closer again last night," Liv said, as if reading his thoughts. "Eric saw their fires from the western ridge. They're being patient, but patience has its limits. What will Hakon do when his patience ends? He'll demand my surrender, probably under threat of attack. When I don't comply because I won't, he'll try to take the village by force to reach me." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but Jorund could hear the guilt underneath. "I should leave. Slip away in the night and lead them away from here. To what end? You're still weak from your ordeal. Winter is deepening, and they have horses while you travel on foot. They would catch you within a day, and your sacrifice would mean nothing, but the village would be safe, would it?" Jorund turned to face her fully. "Do you think Hakon will simply accept that you escaped? He'll blame the village for harboring you, for helping you flee. He'll demand compensation, tribute, maybe hostages. Running away won't protect anyone. It will just ensure you die for nothing." Liv was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the carved bird's wings. "Then what do you propose?" "We make our stand here," Jorund said, the certainty in his voice surprising even him. "We defend what we've built, protect what matters, and show them that some things are worth more than the fear of consequences." "We," Liv repeated softly. "You keep saying we, because that's what we are now," Jorund replied. "Not just you and I, but all of us who've chosen to stand together. The women who came to learn healing, the men who brought supplies, Astrid and Eric and even old Bjorn. We've become something new, something worth defending." As if summoned by his words, voices drifted up from the village below. They could see a group gathering near the longhouse. Not the usual morning assembly, but something more urgent. Even from a distance, they could hear the tension in the shouted words. "We should go," Liv said, starting to rise. But Jorund remained kneeling before the memory stone, his hand resting on his brother's names. "Gunnar, Olaf," he said quietly, "what I'm about to do, I do not for revenge or glory, but for the chance to build something better. Help me be worthy of your memory." The wind stirred around them, carrying the scent of snow and the distant sound of approaching hoofbeats. As they made their way back down the hill toward the village, Jorund felt something he had not experienced since the battle that claimed his brothers, a sense of purpose that went beyond personal pain or glory. He was no longer just a warrior seeking redemption for past failures, but a protector fighting for a future worth having. Behind them, the memory stone stood silent sentinel over the village, guardian of the past, while the living prepared to shape whatever future lay ahead. And in the distance, growing closer with each passing hour, the sound of horses reminded them that the choice between the old ways and the new could no longer be delayed. The council horn's deep, resonant call echoed across Skarnheim, summoning villagers to the longhouse with an urgency that had not been heard since the dark days before the Battle of Raven's Gorge. By the time Jorund and Liv reached the village center, most of the community had already gathered, their faces reflecting a mixture of fear, determination, and uncertainty. Elder Magnus stood before the great hearth, the ancient council horn clutched in his weathered hands. The instrument was older than the village itself, carved from the horn of some great beast and inscribed with runes that spoke of authority and ancient lore. Its voice commanded respect, even from those who disagreed with the man who wielded it. "People of Skarnheim," Magnus began, his voice carrying the weight of his years and position. "Riders approach our borders under the banner of the Iron Wolf clan. They come seeking the exile we have harbored, and their intentions are clear. We face a choice that will determine not just our immediate fate, but the kind of people we choose to be." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Magnus raised the horn for silence. "I have spoken with their leader, Håkon Bjornsson, under a flag of truce. He offers terms that are not unreasonable. Surrender the exile, pay a modest tribute for the trouble we have caused by harboring her, and his clan will depart in peace. No blood need be shed, no lives lost, and if we refuse—" Bjorn the blacksmith called out, his deep voice cutting through the tension. Magnus's pale eyes found Jorund in the crowd, holding his gaze with cold certainty. "Then we face the consequences of defying the ancient laws. 15 armed warriors against our village, with winter limiting our options for retreat or reinforcement. 15 against how many of us?" young Eric asked, stepping forward despite his youth. "Oh, we have hunters, farmers who can fight, men who've seen battle. We have families," Magnus snapped. "Children, elderly, pregnant women. Would you see them suffer for the sake of one exile's pride? Would you see them live as cowards who abandon their friends to satisfy bullies?" Gudrun, the baker's wife, shot back, her round face flushed with anger. "What kind of lesson is that for our children?" The debate that followed was heated, but revealing. The village was indeed split, but not along the lines Magnus had expected. The division was not simply between young and old, or between fighters and non-combatants. Instead, it seemed to follow deeper fault lines between those who valued security above all else, and those who believed some principles were worth defending. Regardless of risk, Astrid spoke for the healers and women who had been learning from Liv. She has already saved 3 children's lives with her knowledge, helped ease Ragnhild's difficult pregnancy, and taught us remedies that will serve our community for generations. Are we to simply hand her over to be murdered because it's convenient? "It's not murder," Magnus protested. "It's justice. She confessed to killing a clan leader's son in self-defense," Freydis interrupted, her voice sharp with personal pain. "As any of us would do if threatened. As any of us should do, but not everyone was convinced." Harold the huntsman voiced the fears many shared. "I've seen what clan wars can do to communities like ours. Villages burned, families scattered, children orphaned. Is one woman worth that risk?" "Perhaps," said an unexpected voice from the crowd. "The question isn't whether she's worth the risk, but whether we're worth defending." All eyes turned to see old Sigrid pushing through the crowd, her bent frame supported by a walking stick, but her eyes bright with fierce determination. The blacksmith's widow commanded respect from everyone in the village, having buried 3 sons to various conflicts, yet somehow maintained her dignity and wisdom. "I've seen more death than most of you," she continued, her voice carrying despite its frailness. "Lost my husband to raiders, my sons to wars, watched this village bury too many good people. But I've also seen what happens to communities that lose their honor, that choose survival over principle time and again. They don't survive, they just exist, growing smaller and meaner with each compromise, until there's nothing left worth preserving." She pointed her walking stick toward Liv, who had remained silent throughout the debate. "That woman there has brought more healing to this village in 3 days than we've seen in 3 years. Not just of bodies, but of spirits. She's reminded us what it means to care for each other, to share knowledge and strength instead of hoarding it out of fear." "Pretty words," Magnus said dismissively, "but they won't stop Iron Wolf blades." "No," Jorund said, finally stepping forward to address the assembly. "But unity might." The crowd grew quiet as the giant warrior moved to stand beside the council horn. Many had not heard him speak publicly since his brothers' deaths, and his presence commanded attention, even from his detractors. "Elder Magnus speaks of ancient laws and proper traditions," Jorund began. his deep voice carrying easily through the longhouse. "But I would remind you all of other traditions, older ones. The duty to protect guests under our roof. The obligation to defend the helpless against those who would harm them. The principle that a community stands or falls together." He looked around the assembled faces, seeing fear, but also hope, uncertainty, but also determination. "3 winters ago, I fought to protect this village using the old ways, strength against strength, violence answering violence. We won that battle, but the cost," his voice caught slightly, "the cost was everything that made victory worthwhile. Liv Eriksdotter has shown us a different kind of strength," he continued. "The strength to heal instead of harm, to teach instead of threaten, to choose hope over fear. If we abandon her now, we abandon the best of ourselves." Magnus stepped forward, his face red with frustration. "Noble words, Jorund, but can your new philosophy stop 15 mounted warriors? Can healing herbs deflect iron blades?" "Perhaps not," Jorund admitted. "But fear certainly cannot. And neither can the kind of community that survives by sacrificing its members to appease every threat that appears on its borders." As the debate continued, Liv finally spoke, her clear voice cutting through the argument. "I will not be the cause of bloodshed here," she said firmly. "If my presence brings danger to innocent people, your presence brings healing to innocent people," Astrid interrupted. "The danger comes from those who cannot accept that a woman might choose justice over submission. The choice is not yours alone to make," Bjorn added, his scarred hands clenched into fists. "You are part of this community now, under our protection. That means we stand together, all of us." The horn's voice echoed once more as Magnus called for order, but the sound now seemed less commanding than desperate. The elder could see the tide turning against him, could feel the village choosing a path he could not support. Outside, the winter wind carried new sounds, the distant whinny of horses, the clank of mail and weapons, the low voices of men preparing for battle. Egon and his iron wolves had grown tired of waiting for an answer that should have been simple. The time for debate was ending, and the moment for choice had arrived. The debate in the longhouse was interrupted by the thunder of hoofbeats and the harsh call of war horns. Through the great doors came a sight that made every villager's blood run cold. 15 mounted warriors in mail and leather, their shields bearing the snarling iron wolf head of their clan. At their head rode a man who could only be Håkon Bjornsson, tall and lean with the predatory grace of a born killer. But it was not Håkon who commanded attention as the riders formed a half-circle before the longhouse. Instead, all eyes turned to the slight figure that rode beside him, a young woman, bound and gagged, her clothes torn and muddy, her eyes wide with terror and desperate hope as she saw the gathered villagers, people of Skarnheim. Håkon's voice rang out like the clash of steel. "I am Håkon Bjornsson of the Iron Wolf clan, and I come seeking justice for my murdered brother." Magnus stepped forward, the council horn still clutched in his hands, but it was Liv who gasped audibly from within the crowd. Her face had gone white as fresh snow, and she started forward, only to be gently but firmly restrained by Jorund's massive hand. "Ingrid," Liv whispered, and the pain in her voice made several villagers turn to look at her with new understanding. Håkon's cold eyes found Liv in the crowd, and his smile was sharp as a blade. "Ah, there she is, the murderess who destroyed my family and brought shame upon our clan." He gestured to the bound woman beside him. "Perhaps you recognize this one? Ingrid Torsdotter, formerly apprentice healer to the exile you harbor. She was most helpful in explaining exactly how my brother died." "Let her go," Liv called out, her voice carrying despite her fear. "Your quarrel is with me, not with her." "My quarrel," Håkon replied coldly, "is with anyone who aided a murderess in her crimes or helped her escape justice." He pulled forth a scroll from his saddle pack, unrolling it with theatrical precision. "This is a blood debt scroll, signed and witnessed according to ancient law. It declares the full circumstances of Knut Bjornsson's death and the exile of Liv Eriksdottir." Magnus stepped closer, his legal mind engaged despite the danger. "Read it then, that all might hear the charges. But as Hakon began to read from the scroll, his confident voice faltered. The words that came forth were not what anyone expected. Let it be known that Knut Bjornsson, son of Bjorn Ironwolf, was slain in lawful combat by Liv Eriksdotter after his attempted rape of said healer. His demands that she brew poisons for his enemies, and his threats against the lives of those under her care. Hakon's face grew dark with confusion and anger. Furthermore, let it be recorded that witnesses Ingrid Thorsdottir and Ulf the Wise can attest to these crimes, and that the exile of Liv Eriksdottir was enacted in direct violation of clan law to prevent her testimony from exposing. Hakon stopped reading abruptly, his face now flushed with rage. This is not "someone has tampered with." "No one has tampered with anything," came a clear voice from behind the Iron Wolf riders. "That scroll is exactly as it was written and witnessed 3 moons ago." A new figure rode into the circle, an elderly man with a long white beard and robes that marked him as a clan law speaker. Behind him rode 6 more warriors, but these bore different heraldry, the Silver Raven of the Northern Council. "I am Ulf the Wise," the old man announced, his voice carrying the authority of one who had spent decades interpreting clan law. "Law speaker for the Northern Council, and witness to the events described in that scroll." The silence that followed was profound. Even Hakon seemed stunned into momentary speechlessness. "That is impossible," Magnus said finally. "The exile was lawful, witnessed, sealed." "The exile," Ulf interrupted, "was a perversion of justice enacted by corrupt clan leaders to hide their own crimes. Knut Bjornsson was not murdered, he was killed in lawful self-defense. Liv Eriksdottir was not exiled for murder, but for threatening to expose a conspiracy of corruption that reached to the highest levels of the Iron Wolf leadership." He gestured to the bound woman. "Ingrid Thorsdottir risked her life to bring me proof of these crimes, documents showing how clan leaders planned to use Liv's healing knowledge to create poisons, how they intended to force her cooperation through threats and assault, how they fabricated evidence to justify her exile when she resisted." "Lies!" Hakon snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. "Truth," Ulf replied calmly. "Witnessed, documented, and confirmed by the Northern Council. Liv Eriksdottir's exile is hereby declared unlawful. Her honor is restored, her shame erased, her accusers condemned." The revelation hit the gathered villagers like a physical blow. Liv, the exile they had debated protecting, was not only innocent, but had been wrongfully condemned for defending herself against evil. The very laws Magnus had cited to justify abandoning her had been perverted to silence a victim. But Hakon was not finished. Drawing his sword in one smooth motion, he pointed it directly at Liv. "Laws and scrolls matter nothing to me now. My brother is dead by her hand, and blood demands blood. I will have satisfaction, council witness or not." "Then you will have it," Jorund said quietly, stepping forward from the crowd. "But not from her." "Jorund, no," Liv whispered, but he was already moving toward the mounted warriors. "I claim right of combat," Jorund announced, his voice carrying clearly across the winter air. "Single combat to the death, champion against champion. If you defeat me, you may pursue your vengeance. If I defeat you, your clan departs and never returns." Hakon's eyes glittered with anticipation. The Iron Wolf leader was known throughout the northern lands as a skilled duelist, and the prospect of killing the famous giant of Skarnheim in single combat would restore much of the honor his brother's crimes had cost their clan. "Accepted," Hakon said immediately. "Tomorrow at dawn before the village gates. Weapons of our choosing, no quarter given or asked." As the Iron Wolf riders withdrew to make camp, the villagers slowly dispersed, their minds reeling from the revelations and the prospect of tomorrow's combat. Liv stood as if frozen, staring at the spot where Hakon had been. "Why did you do that?" she asked Jorund when they were finally alone. "You know what kind of fighter he is. Young, fast, skilled with every weapon. You've been 3 years without serious combat, and he's been fighting constantly. Because," Jorund said simply, "some things are worth fighting for, and some fights are worth having regardless of the odds." Ulf the Wise approached them, Ingrid now freed from her bonds and clinging to live like a lost child, finding her mother. "There is something else," the old law speaker said quietly. "Something the scroll reveals that changes everything." He unrolled another document, this one bearing the seals of multiple clans. "The corruption in the Iron Wolf leadership was not limited to your case, Liv Eriksdottir. They have been using healers throughout the region, forcing them to create poisons and torture aids, threatening their families to ensure compliance. Your resistance was the first crack in their power, and your exile was meant to serve as a warning to others. I mean that tomorrow's combat is not just about your innocence or Hakon's vengeance," Ulf continued. "It is about whether communities like Skarnheim will stand against corruption and choose their own path, or whether they will bow to the demands of those who would pervert healing into harm, justice into oppression." As night fell over Skarnheim, Jorund prepared for a battle that would determine far more than one woman's fate. In his small home, the war axe that had gathered dust for 3 winters was taken down and carefully sharpened, while the man who would wield it contemplated not the glory of victory, but the meaning of the stand he had chosen to make. The truth had been revealed, but truth alone would not be enough. Tomorrow would require the oldest kind of justice, trial by combat, where right and wrong would be decided by strength and skill, and the favor of whatever gods still watched over men who chose principle over safety. Outside, the Iron Wolf fires burned bright against the winter darkness, while inside the village, another kind of fire burned, the flame of a community that had discovered what it truly valued and was prepared to defend it against any cost. The night before the combat passed slowly, marked by the quiet sounds of preparation that echoed through Skarnheim, like prayers whispered in darkness. In the village center, by the light of torches and oil lamps, the women worked with steady determination to complete their newest creation, a banner that would fly over the battlefield come dawn. The Unity Banner was unlike anything the village had ever seen. Where traditional war standards bore the heraldry of single families or clans, this one wove together symbols from every household in Skarnheim. Gudrun's wheat sheaves intertwined with Bjorn's hammer, Astrid's healing herbs bordered Eric's hunting bow, and at the center, a great tree whose roots and branches encompassed them all. Each thread had been chosen with care, each symbol placed with purpose, creating something that spoke of community forged not by blood or tradition alone, but by choice and shared commitment. "It's beautiful," Liv said softly, watching the final stitches being placed by hands that had learned to work together over the past few days. She sat beside the communal loom that had become the heart of their transformation, her own hands busy preparing supplies that she hoped would not be needed but feared would be essential. Young Ragnhild, her pregnancy now safely progressing thanks to Liv's knowledge, looked up from her weaving with tears in her eyes. "My child will grow up in a village that stands for something," she said quietly. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we've already won something precious." In the weapons shop, Bjorn worked by forge light to ensure Jorund's equipment was perfect. The war axe that had hung unused for 3 winters now gleamed with fresh sharpening, its edge keen enough to split hairs. But it was not the only weapon being prepared. The blacksmith had also crafted a new shield, lighter than the massive warboar Jorund had carried in his younger days, designed for speed and maneuverability rather than simply absorbing massive blows. "You're not the same fighter you were at Raven's Gorge," Bjorn said bluntly, as he tested the shield's balance. "You're older, maybe a step slower, certainly more thoughtful. This isn't about overwhelming Hakon with sheer force. It's about fighting smarter." Jorund nodded, understanding the wisdom in his friend's words. 3 years ago, I fought with rage and grief driving my arm. Tomorrow, I fight with purpose. See that you remember the difference when steel meets steel," Bjorn replied, then added more quietly, "Your brothers would be proud, Jorund, not because you're willing to die for principle, but because you've learned to live for something worth defending." Elsewhere in the village, Eric stood watch with the other young men, their eyes scanning the darkness beyond the Iron Wolf campfires. The enemy had made no aggressive moves since establishing their camp, but their very presence was a reminder of what failure would mean. Eric clutched his bow with white knuckles, knowing that if Jorund fell, the defense of the village would rest on shoulders perhaps too young for such responsibility. "Are you afraid?" asked Leif, a boy barely 15 who had begged to be included in the watch. "Terrified," Eric admitted honestly, "but not of dying. I'm afraid of living in a world where strength is only measured by the willingness to hurt others, where communities survive by abandoning their values whenever they're threatened." In the longhouse, Elder Magnus sat alone before the great fire, the council horn resting heavily in his lap. The revelations of the day had shattered many of his certainties, forced him to confront the possibility that his rigid adherence to law and tradition might sometimes serve injustice rather than justice. The exile he had been so eager to cast out was not only innocent, but had been wrongfully condemned by the very legal system he had spent his life defending. As the night deepened, Magnus was joined by Ulf the Wise, who settled beside him with the careful movements of age. "Difficult times for those of us who value order," the law speaker said quietly. "Order without justice is merely tyranny with better organization." Magnus replied, the words bitter in his mouth. "I was so concerned with maintaining tradition that I forgot to ask whether the tradition was worth maintaining." "A mistake many of us have made," Ulf acknowledged. "The law is meant to serve the people, not the other way around. When laws become tools for oppression rather than protection, they must be changed or challenged." In Jorund's small home, the hours passed in quiet preparation of a different sort. Astrid had brought supplies for treating wounds, her healer's mind already planning for various scenarios. Ingrid, still shaken from her ordeal but determined to help, shared everything she knew about Hakon's fighting style and preferred tactics. "He favors his right side," she whispered, her voice still hoarse from captivity. "An old wound to his left shoulder that never healed properly. He compensates well, but under pressure he tends to overcommit to right-handed attacks." Liv listened to every detail, her mind cataloguing information that might save Jorund's life. But her heart was heavy with guilt and fear. "This should not be your burden," she said for the 100th time. "I could still leave, slip away in the darkness, and go where?" Jorund asked gently. "Your innocence is proven, your exile declared unlawful. But Hakon's hatred runs deeper than law or justice. He will pursue you to the ends of the earth if necessary, and innocence will suffer wherever his pursuit leads. Better to end it here, where we can control the terms." "You could be killed," Liv said bluntly. "I could," Jorund acknowledged. "But I could also live, we all could, knowing that when the moment came to choose between expedience and principle, we chose correctly." As dawn approached, the village gathered in the space before the main gates where the combat would take place. The Unity banner flew proudly from a tall pole, its colorful threads bright against the gray winter sky. Behind it stood the people of Skarnheim, no longer divided by fear and tradition, but united by the understanding that some stands must be taken regardless of cost. Hakon emerged from his camp like a predator sensing prey, his armor gleaming and his sword sharp. He moved with the confidence of a man who had never lost single combat, who saw in the aging giant before him an opportunity for glory and revenge. His remaining warriors formed a loose circle around the combat ground, their presence a reminder that this was more than personal dispute. It was a test of philosophies, a clash between those who took what they wanted by force and those who believed strength should serve protection rather than domination. Jorund walked to meet his opponent with steady steps, the war axe balanced easily in his hands, despite its considerable weight. The shield on his left arm bore no heraldry. He fought not for his own glory, but for the community that had become his family. Behind him, he could feel the weight of their hopes and fears, their trust in his strength and their faith in the justice of their cause. Ulf the Wise stood between the combatants, his voice carrying clearly across the winter air. "This combat is witnessed by the Northern Council and accepted under ancient law. Single combat to the death, no quarter given or received. The victor's cause is judged righteous, the defeated's condemned. Are both fighters prepared? I am, Håkon said, his voice sharp with anticipation. I am, Jorund replied, his tone calm as deep water. As the first rays of true sunlight touched the hilltops around Skarnheim, Ulf raised his staff and then brought it down sharply against the frozen ground. The sound rang out like a bell, and with it the final battle for the soul of the village began. But this would be no mere contest of strength against strength. It would be a test of everything Jorund had learned about himself, about leadership, about the difference between fighting for glory and fighting for something greater than oneself. The war axe in his hands was the same weapon that had served him at Raven's Gorge. But the man who wielded it was transformed, no longer a warrior seeking to prove his worth through violence, but a protector defending the fragile hope of a community that had chosen love over fear. The circle was drawn, the terms set, the witnesses gathered. All that remained was to discover whether 3 years of growth and change had made Jorund stronger or weaker, whether wisdom could triumph over skill, whether the choice to build rather than destroy would prove worth the ultimate price. The first clash of steel rang across the winter morning like a bell-tolling judgment. Håkon came at Jorund with the fluid grace of a born warrior, his sword singing through the air in patterns that spoke of years of training and countless victories. But the giant met each strike with steady determination, his war axe moving in the ancient rhythms that his father had taught him, that his father's father had passed down through generations of northern fighters. What surprised everyone watching, including Håkon himself, was that Jorund did not immediately press his considerable advantages of size and strength. Instead, he fought defensively, using his shield to deflect attacks while studying his opponent's movements with the patience of a hunter. This was not the berserker rage that had made him legendary at Raven's Gorge, but something more thoughtful, more controlled. "Fight me," Håkon snarled after several minutes of careful circling and testing strikes. "Are you so old that you can only cower behind your shield?" Jorund did not rise to the taunt. He had learned in 3 years of painful self-examination that anger made men predictable. Instead, he continued his methodical defense, noting how Håkon favored his right side, just as Ingrid had warned, how the younger man's excellent technique carried a subtle flaw. He committed too fully to his attacks, leaving himself momentarily vulnerable with each aggressive strike. The peace-offering bowl had been placed at the edge of the combat circle by Ulf the Wise, a ceremonial vessel that spoke of the possibility, however remote, that honor might be satisfied without death. It was an ancient tradition, one that allowed combatants to end their dispute if both agreed the point had been proven. But as Jorund watched Håkon's eyes, cold, calculating, filled with a hatred that went deeper than justice or law, he knew the bowl would remain untouched. "You cannot hide forever." "Old man," Håkon taunted, pressing his attack with renewed fury. "Your village watches you shame yourself. Your woman sees you revealed as a coward." Still, Jorund did not respond to the words, though several villagers stirred angrily at the insults. Instead, he began to shift his tactics slightly, moving from pure defense to what fighters called defensive offense, allowing Håkon to overextend himself, then punishing the younger man's aggression with precisely timed counterstrikes that drew first blood without committing to anything that might leave him exposed. The cut on Håkon's sword arm was shallow, barely more than a scratch, but its psychological impact was profound. The Iron Wolf leader had expected to overwhelm his older opponent quickly, to end the fight with a display of superior skill and youth. Instead, he found himself facing a wall of patient competence that seemed to absorb his best efforts, while slowly, methodically, turning his own aggression against him. "Impossible," one of the Iron Wolf warriors muttered from the sidelines. Håkon has never been touched so early in a fight. But Liv, watching with a healer's trained eye for the mechanics of combat, saw what was happening. Jorund was not fighting the battle Håkon expected, Not the clash of warriors seeking glory, but the methodical work of a protector who understood that victory mattered more than style. Every movement was economical. Every defensive position chosen to conserve energy while forcing his opponent to work harder, tire faster, make the kinds of mistakes that could be exploited. "He's fighting like a teacher," Astrid whispered to Eric, who stood beside her with white knuckles gripping his bow. "Like someone who's learned from every mistake and wants to pass the lesson on." The observation was more accurate than she knew. Jorund had spent 3 years replaying every battle he had ever fought, analyzing not just his victories, but his failures, understanding the difference between winning and proving a point. At Raven's Gorge, he had fought with the fury of a man trying to protect everything he loved, but that fury had cost him his brothers when rage made him careless of consequences. Today, he fought with the wisdom of a man who had learned that the greatest victories were those that preserved rather than destroyed. Hakon pressed his attack again, his swordwork brilliant but increasingly desperate, as he realized that his usual tactics were not producing the expected results. The older warrior before him absorbed punishment that should have staggered him, turned aside strikes that should have found their mark, and waited with the patience of stone for opportunities that might never come. But patience, Jorund knew, was not the same as passivity. As Hakon committed to another overextended thrust, favoring his strong right side exactly as Ingrid had predicted, Jorund finally acted. His counter was not the wild swing of a berserker, but the precise, measured blow of a craftsman who had found exactly the right moment to use exactly the right tool. The war axe caught Hakon's blade near the hilt, using the younger man's own momentum to drive the weapon wide while stepping inside his guard. For a moment they were face to face, and Hakon could see in Jorund's eyes not the rage he expected, but something far more dangerous, absolute certainty of purpose. "Yield," Jorund said quietly, his axe positioned for a killing blow. "This need not end in death." But Hakon's answer was a hidden dagger, drawn from his belt and thrust upward toward Jorund's ribs with desperate fury. The movement was outside the bounds of honorable combat, a violation of the single combat tradition that brought gasps of outrage from both sides of the watching circle. The blade found its mark, sliding between armor plates to draw blood. But Jorund's response was swift and final. Jorund's war axe swept in a perfect arc, not driven by rage, but guided by necessity and justice. The blade caught Hakon across the chest, a blow that would have split a lesser man in two, but instead sent the Iron Wolf leader staggering backward, his hidden dagger falling from nerveless fingers as he collapsed to his knees in the snow. The silence that followed was profound. Even the winter wind seemed to hold its breath as Hakon knelt bleeding in the combat circle, his eyes wide with the shock of defeat and approaching death. Around the circle, warriors from both sides stood frozen, understanding that they had witnessed more than just a victory. They had seen the decisive moment in a conflict between two very different ideas of what strength meant. But Jorund did not deliver a killing blow. Instead, he stood over his fallen opponent, the war axe ready but not moving, his breathing steady despite the wound in his side that painted his shirt crimson. "Yield," he said again, his voice carrying clearly across the winter morning. "Your hatred has cost enough." In this, Hakon looked up at him with eyes that held more than pain. They held the bitter recognition of complete defeat, not just of his body, but of everything he represented. He had fought with skill and treachery both, and still the older warrior stood above him, offering mercy when law and tradition demanded death. Hakon's voice was weak, blood specking his lips as he struggled to speak. "I cannot, my honor, your honor," Ulf the Wise interrupted, stepping into the circle with the authority of law and tradition behind him, "was forfeit the moment you drew that hidden blade. Single combat has rules, and you have broken them before all these witnesses." The Iron Wolf warriors stirred uneasily, their loyalty to their leader warring with their understanding of what they had seen. The use of a concealed weapon in formal combat was not just dishonorable. It was a violation so fundamental that it voided any claim to victory. regardless of the outcome. But it was Liv who moved next, crossing the circle with steady steps despite the danger. She knelt beside Hakon, her healer's instincts overriding any personal hatred or fear. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, assessing his wounds with the same care she would give to any patient. "The cut is deep, but not necessarily fatal," she said quietly, looking up at Jorund. "If treated quickly and properly, he could live." "Why?" Hakon gasped, staring at her with confusion and something that might have been shame. "Why would you, after what I—" "Because," Liv said simply, opening her healing satchel and beginning to work, "healing is what I do. Not because you deserve it, but because someone must choose to stop the cycle of death and revenge." The gesture sent ripples of astonishment through both groups of watchers. Here was the woman Hakon had pursued across the Winterlands, whom he had threatened and terrorized, whose friends he had endangered, and she was working to save his life. It was an act of grace so unexpected, so completely at odds with the logic of vengeance and honor, that it seemed to redefine the very nature of strength. Around the combat circle, the shield wall stones that the villagers had placed as defensive barriers began to take on new meaning. They were no longer just protection against violence, but symbols of a different kind of strength, the strength that came from communities standing together, from choosing protection over aggression, from defending principles rather than territory. As Liv worked to stabilize Hakon's wounds, Eric and several other young villagers began moving among the Iron Wolf warriors, offering water and food to men who had ridden hard through the winter cold. It was a gesture that spoke of the village's new understanding, that enemies could become neighbors, that conflicts could end in healing rather than destruction, one by one. The Iron Wolf warriors began to lower their weapons. Their leaders' dishonorable tactics had shamed them all, and the mercy being shown by their supposed enemies made their own position untenable. These were not the monsters they had been told to expect, but people acting with a dignity that their own actions had conspicuously lacked. Jorund finally lowered his war axe, the weapon that had defined him for so many years, now feeling strangely heavy in his hands. The victory was complete, but it felt nothing like the triumphs of his youth. There was no exultation, no sense of glory earned through violence. Instead, there was only a quiet satisfaction that justice had been served and mercy had been shown. "It is finished," Ulf the Wise declared, his voice carrying the weight of law and judgment. "The combat is concluded, honor is satisfied, and justice is served. Let all who witness this day remember that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to know when destruction is necessary and when mercy serves better." As the circle began to disperse, as the Iron Wolf warriors prepared to carry their wounded leader home in shame rather than glory, as the villagers of Skarnheim began to understand what they had accomplished, Jorund felt something settle in his chest that had been missing for 3 long winters. His brothers' voices seemed to whisper in the wind, not with the pain of loss, but with the pride of a job well done, not through violence, but through the kind of strength that built rather than destroyed, that healed rather than harmed, that chose the harder path because it was the right one. The battle was over, but the real victory was just beginning. 6 months later, as spring flowers bloomed in the meadows around Skarnheim, the village prepared for a celebration unlike any in its long history. The wedding of Jorund Grimsson and Liv Eriksdotter would be marked not with the traditional exchange of weapons and war gifts, but with something entirely new, twin circlets of woven silver and iron that symbolized the union of strength and gentleness, war and peace, and tradition and progress that had come to define their transformed community. The wedding crowns rested on a simple wooden table before the longhouse, their intertwining metals catching the warm sunlight. They had been crafted by Bjorn the blacksmith and the village women working together, each strand carefully shaped to represent the different kinds of strength that bound communities together. The silver spoke of healing and wisdom, the iron of protection and resolve, and their joining created something more beautiful and enduring than either metal alone could achieve. Elder Magnus stood before the assembled villagers, his weathered face bearing an expression of contentment that would have seemed impossible during those dark winter days. The revelations about Liv's innocence and the corruption she had exposed had forced him to examine many of his most cherished beliefs. But the process had left him wiser rather than bitter. "We gather today," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd, "not just to witness the union of two people, but to celebrate the kind of community we have chosen to become. A place where strength serves protection rather than domination, where wisdom is shared rather than hoarded, where mercy and justice walk hand in hand." The transformation of Skarnheim had been remarkable to witness. The knowledge Liv had shared with Astrid and the other healers had saved dozens of lives through the difficult winter months. The collaborative spirit that had begun with the community loom had spread to every aspect of village life. From shared food stores that ensured no family went hungry to cooperative child-rearing that freed both men and women to contribute their skills where they were most needed. Young Eric, now recognized as one of the village's most promising leaders despite his youth, stepped forward to speak. 6 months ago, we faced a choice between the easy path of abandoning a stranger and the difficult path of standing for our principles. Today, we understand that the difficult path was actually the easier one, easier to live with, easier to defend, easier to pass on to our children. In the crowd, faces told the story of change better than any words could. Old Sigrid beamed with pride at the community her lifetime of wisdom had helped shape. Astrid and the other healers wore the confident expressions of those whose knowledge served the greater good. The young mothers like Ragnhild held their children with the security of knowing they lived in a place that valued life and growth over fear and conflict. Even some of the Iron Wolf warriors had chosen to remain in the region, drawn by the example of Skarnheim's transformation. They had built a small settlement a day's ride away, sending envoys to learn the village's methods of cooperative governance and shared prosperity. Hakon himself, after recovering from his wounds, had departed in exile from his own clan, his dishonorable conduct having cost him everything he once valued. But word had come that he was seeking to make amends for his past actions, using his knowledge of corrupt practices to help other communities identify and root out similar problems. As the ceremony proceeded, Liv and Jorund exchanged vows that spoke not of possession or dominance, but of partnership and mutual support. They promised to face whatever challenges might come with the same unity of purpose that had brought them together, to use their combined strengths in service of something larger than themselves. "I was a warrior who had forgotten how to build," Jorund said, his deep voice gentle as he took Liv's hands. "You taught me that the strongest fortifications are not made of stone and timber, but of trust and shared commitment. I promise to protect what we have built together, not just with sword and shield, but with wisdom and compassion." "I was a healer cast out for refusing to use my knowledge for harm," Liv replied, her pale blue eyes bright with tears of joy rather than sorrow. "You showed me that exile can become homecoming, that being cast out by those who fear justice can lead to being embraced by those who choose it. I promise to use my gifts in service of our community, to teach others as I have been taught, to heal not just bodies, but the bonds between people." When the wedding crowns were placed upon their heads, the gesture was more than ceremonial. It represented the joining of two philosophies that had once seemed contradictory: the warrior's strength and the healer's gentleness, the protector's resolve and the teacher's patience. Together, they created a new model of leadership that served rather than commanded, that inspired rather than intimidated. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with music and storytelling that wove together the village's past and future. Children who had once feared Jorund now climbed on his massive shoulders, while their parents sought Liv's advice not just on matters of health, but on the countless challenges of building a life worth living. As the evening stars appeared overhead, Jorund and Liv stood together at the edge of the village, looking out over the valley that had become their home. In the distance, lights flickered from other settlements that had sent representatives to witness the wedding and learn from Skarnheim's example. "Do you think it will last?" Liv asked quietly, her hand resting comfortably in Jorund's. "This thing we've built here, will it survive when we're gone?" "I think," Jorund replied, watching young Eric and Astrid teaching a group of children how to weave strong rope from individual strands, "that we've planted something that will grow beyond us. Not because we were perfect, but because we chose to try." Above them, the wedding crowns caught the starlight, their silver and iron gleaming like a promise made manifest. In a world often harsh and unforgiving, they had proven that communities could choose compassion over fear, that strength could serve love rather than dominance, that two broken people could heal not just each other, but everyone around them. The giant warrior and the exiled healer had indeed changed their village forever, but perhaps more importantly, they had shown that love, real, practical, committed love, could change the world itself. One choice, one day, one act of courage at a time.